Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Newsroom. I'm your host, Khalid. Today is the 28th of June 2022. These are the stories that we'll be discussing in detail during the course of the show. We'll begin, ladies and gentlemen, by the situation as far as Sri Lanka is concerned. We know that Sri Lanka has defaulted on its debt. We also know that Sri Lanka is going through its worst economic crisis since it became independent in 1948. Now, what has happened is that a lot of protests are happening in Sri Lanka against all the different economic woes that the people are confronted with. The troops in Sri Lanka have handed tokens on Monday to people who were queuing for petrol amongst a severe fuel shortage in the nation. And not only has there been a food shortage, there's a fuel shortage, and all of it is accumulated due to the defaulting on the debt of Sri Lanka. Now, a lot of countries are trying to help. The IMF is also holding discussions with Sri Lanka, and this is what we're going to discuss in our first segment, the economic woes of Sri Lanka. Our second story, ladies and gentlemen, concerns the lack of freedom as far as the journalistic community in India is concerned. Now, Pratik Sinha, who's editor of the Indian fact-checking website Alt News, has said that the co-founder of Alt News, that is a fact-checking website, has been arrested by the Indian police. And why is that? Because he has been talking openly against what the Indian government is perpetrating within India. And the latest that he had talked about was the insulting, of course, comments that came, the blasphemous comments that came from the BJP spokespersons. And as a result of it, whether on the one side we have journalists whose Twitter handles are being muted in India, on the other hand we have journalists who are being muted altogether, just as this person, Muhammad Zubair. We are going to talk about journalistic freedom or the lack of it thereof in India in our second segment. Our third story, ladies and gentlemen, concerns 46 people, at least that number, that has been found dead in an abandoned lorry on the outskirts of San Antonio, Texas. Now, what happens is that San Antonio, Texas is the bridgeway between Mexico and the US, and a lot of people take part in human immigration and illegal immigration, and they bring these people together cropped up in lorries, and what happens is that people then either wither away due to illness or die due to different diseases, or even being together in a lorry enclosed without any water or food whatsoever, and that creates dehydration, that creates a lot of issues. 16 people including 4 children have also been taken to the hospital. The survivors were hot to the touch and suffering from heat stroke and heat exhaustion. Let's begin with our first segment, and that concerns the economic worsening of the situation in Sri Lanka. More in the following report, then we'll return with a detailed discussion on this.
Sri Lanka is embroiled in worst economic crisis since decades as the pandemic dealt a heavy blow to country's economy that depends heavily on tourism and trade. The cash-strapped Indian Ocean nation of 22 million is battling a foreign exchange crisis that prompted currency devaluation and hit payments for essential imports. Without enough foreign currencies to pay for imports of essential goods, an acute shortage of food, fuel and medicines has helped to push the cost of living to record highs. Sri Lanka has run out of fuel, and officials said the country has only 9,000 tons of diesel and 6,000 tons of petrol to fuel essential services in the coming days. Sri Lankan government has announced a 2-week halt to all fuel sales except for essential services and called for a partial shutdown as its unprecedented economic crisis deepened. Earlier this month, the United Nations launched an emergency response to island's crippling economic crisis, feeding thousands of pregnant women who are facing food shortages. 4 out of 5 people in Sri Lanka have started skipping meals as they cannot afford to eat. The United Nations has said, warning of a looming dire humanitarian crisis with millions in need of aid. Sri Lanka defaulted on its $51 billion foreign debt in April and is in talks with the International Monetary Fund for a bailout.
Javed Hassan, who is an economic journalist and coordinator and consultant, joins us online. Thank you very much, Javed Hassan, to have joined us. Javed Saab, tell us a little bit about Sri Lanka. What I fail to understand is why aren't the different countries that want to help Sri Lanka or the IMF going forward with it, and why is Sri Lanka going day after day into an economic crisis that is worsening with every passing 24 hours?
Well, thank you very much for having me on. Sri Lanka has been helped by its neighboring country, India. They first lent it $5 billion to buy food and fuel. And there's a further credit line of about $2.5 billion being made available. Similarly, China has been helping Sri Lanka. But the problems are very severe. They're not going to be sorted out any time soon. They really have been, to a large extent, brought upon by themselves to a degree, but also due to a number of exogenous shocks. What did severely affect Sri Lanka was the COVID crisis which the world faced. But Sri Lanka was very highly dependent on tourism income for its foreign exchange revenue. That virtually stopped during the COVID crisis. It used to earn something like $3.5 billion every year, and that came to virtually zero during the COVID crisis. That has been exacerbated by some tax cuts which were instituted around 2020 fiscal. The Sri Lankan economy has always suffered from high fiscal deficits. In 2020, it was around 12.5% of GDP. With the fiscal sort of allowances made with tax cuts, that worsened. The fiscal worsening translated into further borrowing externally, which further exacerbated the problems. So while the exogenous shocks or the external shocks are there, both in terms of COVID as well as commodity prices, some of this has been brought upon itself by government's poor governance, I dare say. And it's sad to say this at this juncture, but it's something we should keep mind of at every country. Sri Lanka classically suffers from twin deficit problem, both in terms of fiscal deficit and current account deficit. And
I understand the whole history of it. I understand the mistakes that have been made by successive governments in Sri Lanka. But what about now, Javed sir? What needs to be done now at a very quick level, at an emergency level, in order for people to come out of this crisis, at least slowly and steadily? But nevertheless, this needs to be a stepwise thing, and this needs to happen now. Why are people still queuing for petrol? Why are people still having issues with eating properly? Why are people still having other energy-related problems? Why is there not some kind of a solution coming out?
I completely agree with you. There should be an emergency measures taken by the world forces, by United Nations, by World Bank, by IMF. I think IMF is already in discussions. They've had a number of consultations with Sri Lanka. IMF has itself a process where the government has to agree with a number of measures that it has to take. We know that in Pakistan as well, it doesn't happen immediately. However, the other sort of stakeholders, and there are a number of stakeholders, Sri Lanka is an important country, should be coming forward. And these include both multilateral agencies like United Nations and other development agencies. But it has to be remembered, this crisis has sort of materialized very suddenly in the last couple of months. And now there's a realization that things are becoming dire. There's food shortages. There's just today, as you mentioned, there's 2 weeks of basically curfew or halt on fuel being supplied other than for essential services. I imagine that in the next few weeks, we'll see a much greater urgency on the part of international donors.
But Javed sir, I understand that in the next few weeks, I totally agree with you. In the next weeks, we are going to see a more urgent response from the different countries. But you know, can Sri Lanka wait for the next few weeks? Shouldn't the next few weeks should have been the previous week or the previous days or today? This economic crisis the world is looking at since the last couple of weeks. We have been talking about this crisis since the last couple of weeks. Why isn't the world body reacting as it should, you know? Because when we see queues for petrol, when we see that the country has only 9,000 tons of diesel, 6,000 tons of petrol to fuel essential resources in their own country, when there is an acute energy shortage and they are looking towards countries such as Qatar, such as Russia, to secure cheap oil supplies and so on and so forth, and then the food crisis and then the economic crisis in general, no money in the country. I mean, I don't understand. India and China are helping, but shouldn't other countries step into the fray as well? Can't the West come in?
I could not agree with you more. The West should come in. Other countries in the Middle East should come in. There should be some supply, at least in the short term, in terms of very easy credit for fuel. Probably for the next 1 year, there should be fuel supplied on a basis that it will be paid much later. These are things that should happen immediately. However, I think we have to also accept the world is distracted by a lot of what is happening in Ukraine and Russia. So there is a certain amount of distraction. And it has to be also said, I mean, it's very difficult to ever blame a country that is going through so many difficulties, especially the people. But the government has been very slow to react and to reach out to IMF. Until a few weeks back, it was unwilling to accept or deal with IMF. I think a small degree of criticism has to go to the government in Sri Lanka
The
as well.
government should
But
have
let's
been more flexible, in my point of view, Javed Sahab. Do you agree with that? And also, do you feel that the political crisis that engulfed Sri Lanka in the last few months that we saw as well, and we have talked about it as well, has also contributed to that?
Indeed, very much so. I think very often such political mayhem does not help in actually alleviating the people's problem. What the people need is stability. They need some political coherence. They need people, the various stakeholders in the politics in Sri Lanka to be on the same page. Unfortunately, that was not the case. There was mayhem. The opposition party was on the streets trying to destabilize the government. We have to be very mindful of that. In such circumstances, probably the desire to overthrow an existing government is probably less desirous than in many other occasions. So yes, I would agree. There was less coherence on the Sri Lankan stakeholders' part as well. But
All right.
really,
Javed Sahab, is there a current political consensus to move forward under the current situation?
I think that has built up relatively quickly now. I mean, it has taken time now, but now there is a greater appreciation. And what we do have is a finance minister who is very level-headed. And I think even this prime minister is also talking a lot of sensible things. And what there is this understanding that there needs to be an urgency for reform, and they will implement and take on board IMF. I mean, it's fundamentally important that IMF comes in as quickly as possible, and that is supported by international community, including.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the economic situation as far as money is concerned. Now, the Sri Lankan Prime Minister, Mr. Wickremesinghe, says that the country needs at least $5 billion to pay for its essential commodities over the next 6 months. The IMF's bailout packages of $3 billion US. Which other country can help sustain Sri Lanka with the rest of the $2 billion?
I think very much like what we have seen in our own country, there has to be possibly help from China. There can be Middle Eastern help, especially in oil facilities. In the case of Sri Lanka, they have reasonably neighborly relations with India. That should come in. India has already provided some help, so hopefully they will provide. So 3 billion should not be the sum total of what is provided to Sri Lanka. It should be more like 8-9 billion. This was a relatively large economy. We have to remember, before the crisis, Sri Lanka's per capita GDP was almost twice that of Pakistan, and even about 70% higher than India. So this is a very viable economy. They have gone through a short-term liquidity crunch, and if that liquidity crunch can be overcome, hopefully some degree of sanity and stability can be restored.
When you talk of the economic crunch, in your point of view, what were the main factors behind this economic crunch that led to Sri Lanka to this economic crunch? You've talked about COVID-19, that is one of the factors. Is there any other factor apart from political instability? And secondly, what are the economic reforms that you feel Sri Lanka now should move forward with in order to prevent itself from such crises in the future?
Okay, one thing very simply, there was the global commodity cycle, which is affecting almost every developing country, has affected, every importing country has affected Sri Lanka very sharply. So there was the COVID, which affected tourism, but the global commodity cycle, where oil prices have increased by something like 70-80%, as well as other commodities, that has very adversely affected the current account position in Sri Lanka. In terms of what it needs to do, it really needs to get back into an IMF program as soon as possible. With that, it needs to have a sensible fiscal policy. It needs to really curtail expenditure. There was a lot of expenditure in Sri Lanka. A lot of this was in terms of infrastructural spending. That needs to be cut. while there has to be a focus on low-income sectors, how to support them going through this crisis. So there are very viable solutions to what Sri Lanka, but it will require political will, and it will require the willingness of the international community to help it do that. But it is a viable country. We have to remember in HDI, it is much higher than all the subcontinent countries. In fact, its HDI was at 0.72. It has almost 99% literacy. It is a relatively developed country. So it's very sad to see such a country go through this. But it needs to really adopt pretty radically different economic policies, which means freeing up the markets, removing price controls, in having fiscal policies which reduce the deficit. It is simply unsustainable to have 12% fiscal deficit. We really must look forward to a position where they have primary fiscal surplus and possibly much lower level of fiscal deficit.
How can a country like Sri Lanka have primary fiscal surplus in your point of view? Do you feel it needs to be more export oriented? Do you feel that its imports need to be curtailed to some extent? What needs to be done in your point of view? If one had to ask you 2 or 3 measures that need to be taken.
No, in terms of, let's look at the fiscal, that's separate from the external account. The fiscal, they really need to cut down on developmental expenditure, especially regarding infrastructure. It really needs to be focused more on catering for the poorest sections in income support. But otherwise, most of the expenditure, which is long-term development, that should be cut and cut immediately. That will help considerably. And also some of the subsidies that existed in the economy, those need to be cut. It was a heavily subsidized economy. There was lots of price controls. That needs to be cut. In terms of the external side, I think the currency depreciation would have helped a lot in terms of exports. What it needs is a degree of stability to come back. And what we also hope to have, and this is to a certain extent a $1 million question, with COVID now being a less of an issue and with stability, we should hope tourism revives and also many of its own exports like oil, coconut oil and other things start picking up. So it's not a journey that will be sorted out in just 6 months or a year. It will take 2 to 3 years. But as I said, it has a number. Moreover, it has a very strong human capital where you have 99% literacy. It has always relied on remittances. Once these remittances are restored, because that has also suffered, because as you see an economy collapse, remittances also tend to slow down. So that will also come back. And moreover, you might see many Sri Lankans unfortunately leave the country, but that in turn will also help remittances. So there are a number of factors that will, but what it really needs, and in all of these things, what is critically important always is the restoration of confidence, restoration of belief in the future. And once that happens, I would imagine things will start turning around very quickly.
Javed sir, we talk about restoration of confidence, restoration of belief of the people. Now, I'd like to refer you to the subsidies. Subsidies is a very tricky situation, or a very tricky substance, let's put it, in the economy of any country, where on the one hand, the government wants to help the people out by subsidizing different products. On the other hand, it affects its economy. The government is basically walking on a tightrope when it comes to subsidies, and we've seen that as an example in Sri Lanka as well. How should a country move forward in order to not put too much of burden on the people, but at the same time not come under economic vows as far as subsidies are concerned?
I think we have to be very honest. We have to allow the markets to operate. So the pricing of commodities, essential commodities as well, should be really market determined. But obviously, given what's happening in global market prices, there is a section of society that needs to be protected. So, and this seems like a much used word, there has to be very targeted subsidies at the bottom 10, bottom 20% of the population. They need to be supported. The rest of the population probably have some degree of savings, have a better level of earnings, and they really should not be subject to subsidies. And this is something which is across the world that tends to be a problem, where there's indiscriminate subsidization of the populace, you tend to really actually do a lot of harm to the economy without necessarily benefiting those that are most needed. The other thing that really subsidy should be removed is to industry, whether in terms of capital provision, in terms of interest-free or cheap loans, as well as price fixing. Those are things that really need to be removed, and you had far too much of that in Sri Lanka. And as soon as that happened, and in fact, the finance minister actually said that if anything, the default will force us to do some of the right things in terms of removing price controls.
Thank you very much, Javed Hassan, economic consultant, talking to us about the latest situation in Sri Lanka. And of course, it's a worsening economic situation. But of course, Javed Hassan discussed with us in detail on the measures that need to be taken in the short term, in the long term, and how Sri Lanka has come to be in the state that it is in. Let's hope that our friendly country, Sri Lanka, who we've helped in the past deal with the Tamil Tigers as well, can stand again on its own 2 feet. It's a wonderful country. It's a beautiful country. We wish it all the very best for its future. Let's come to our second story, and that concerns India and the journalistic freedom, rather the lack of it. We've seen how different journalists are being muted on social media platforms such as Twitter in India. The people in India can no longer look at their tweets or their messages or what they're trying to say as far as the realities of what the BJP government is perpetrating. Now what has happened is Alt News, which is a fact-checking website, its co-founder Mohammad Zubair has been arrested by Indian police because Mohammad Zubair has been highlighting different realities that the BJP government is involved in, the latest being the blasphemous comments that were made by the BJP spokesperson. More in the following report.
The democratic freedom of speech and expression is under severe threat in India as every person exposing BJP's hate, bigotry and lies faces persecution and harassment. Indian police has arrested journalist Mohammad Zubair, who is the co-founder of fact-checking website ALT News. Mohammad Zubair, a former telecom engineer from the southern IT hub of Bengaluru, founded ALT News in 2017 with other co-founder Prateek Sinha, and since then the website has busted numerous fake news stories, mostly pushed by Hindu right-wing portals, and claims made by members of the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party or its supporters. Journalists, activists and opposition leaders have condemned Zubair's arrest, demanding his immediate release and calling the police move an assault on truth. In a statement posted on Twitter, DigiPub News India Foundation, a network of digital media organizations, said the use of stringent laws as tools against journalists must stop. India ranks 150th on the 2022 World Press Freedom Index published by the press watchdog Reporters Without Borders. On World Press Freedom Day, 10 rights groups said Indian authorities are prosecuting journalists and critics under stringent laws of criticizing the government's policies. India is also blocking flow of information to Indian Twitter by withholding access to accounts of certain journalists and organizations, both Indian and international, who are critical of the Modi regime.
Political analyst Safi Ghauri joins us online. Safi, thank you very much to have joined us. It has been some time since we talked on any topic on this show. Safi, when it comes to India and when it comes to the journalistic freedom or the lack of it, there are numerous stories if you just look in the present, in the recent past or in the past as well. But these stories are gaining momentum, are increasing in number. The latest being the story of Mohammad Zubair, who's been put in jail just because he's been telling out the truths. This and so much more. We've got the story of Rana Ayub. We've got the story of so many other journalists who can no longer have access to their viewers in India because they've been banned. What is India looking at?
It's you're absolutely right, Omar, and it's very tragic because India for the longest time was upheld around the world as the world's biggest democracy, and because with democracy comes another pillar, which is freedom of expression. And so I would think that at least for the vast majority of India's history, it had a fairly good degree of freedom of expression. However, today we see a new law. Just a little while ago, I read that India has also blocked the Twitter accounts of Pakistani
missions abroad, yes, as well as Radio Pakistan.
Yeah, so they've done all of that. But this arrest of Mohammad Zubair is downright bizarre because if you think about it, he's been arrested for a tweet that he made close to 4 years ago. And 4 years ago, the tweet was asking why they named a hotel after a Hindu god. And so this is a questioning. It was a questioning tweet. It's not like he has, through that tweet, done anything that's in any manner insightful. However, 4 years later, today, he is being arrested for a 2018 tweet, which and according to India, the exact sections that have been placed on him are section 153 and section 295A, which are downright hilarious because they are pointed towards the idea of provoking any particular religious group so that it causes riots. I don't think anyone would start writing if you ask, even if you ask a religious group why they have named a particular hotel group, especially if you have done so 4 years in the past. Now, it was a very, very old tweet for which he has suddenly been arrested. Secondly, it's impertinent to say that this is the 6th FIR against him in the last 2 years. And in the last 5 years, he has consecutively won every case. And in previous FIRs, the High Court of India has even asked the police not to arrest him because they keep saying that the police is being malicious against him. Yet, the police still arrested him, took him to an undisclosed location. His lawyers still do not have access to the FIR. And the strangest thing is that he has not even been produced before a duty magistrate. Keep in mind, of course, that the law of Pakistan and India are the same. So we have similar legal structures. He has not even been produced before a duty magistrate, which is a necessity to be done so in 24 hours. Instead, he has been taken to a special cell. All for what? For a tweet that says why a hotel was named after a Hindu god 4 years ago. This is very clearly malicious. This banks of absolute corruption within the Indian government, which just wants to silence voices now. They want to make an example out of Mohammed Zubair. They want to try and show that Mohammed
But herein, Safi, lies the dichotomy, because I was smiling a little bit before when you were talking of when he was arrested. The fact remains that isn't it the Indian government, isn't it the BJP that continues its hatred campaign of hatred against the Muslims and other minorities through its different tweets, through its different articles, through its different sermons, and yet nothing happens to them. When it comes to a journalist who talks the truth, he is put into jail, he or she is muted. We have the example of Rana Ayub as well. And speaking of that, Safi, I would also like to add one more thing. There has been a recent commitment by India along with the G7 states to on press freedom. What press freedom? What are they talking about? Does the world not understand what India is doing?
I think it was just downright hilarious. I also read the news story on its commitment to uphold press freedom. In fact, it's funny that at a time when India is committing to uphold press freedom, global human rights organizations are reporting that it's not just press freedom, but every single human right in India is going down the drain, and it is one of the worst performing countries when it comes to the depletion of human rights. It's Human Rights Measurement Initiative, which is the name of the NGO that measures these human rights indexes. And according to them, everything in India, freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, all these freedoms, right to education, food, health, housing, right to work, basic fundamental rights, all of them have deteriorated in India. And yet we see this constant barrage of propaganda by Indian media. And I think that's why people like Mohammed Zubair are arrested, because they're the ones who come and debunk the Indian notions, the Indian lies that are being propagated and being spread to their own populations. If people like this were allowed to speak up, then Indian citizens would understand that their government is consistently lying to them.
But Safi, this is a censorship, if not more. Now, when you see a country moving towards genocide in Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, and yet there is a media silence on that, and those who are trying to say anything, their voices are muted. On the other hand, India continues unabated when it comes to the whatever it's perpetrating within India. I'm not just talking of Indian held Jammu and Kashmir. I'm also talking of within India, and yet nobody speaks. In the world, nobody speaks. There are certain sentiments that are said, especially. Also, I would like to comment on what the US has been saying in the last few months as far as human rights situation in India is concerned, yet nothing. So India can do whatever it wants. It can silence whosoever it wants. It can use the law, the judiciary, on its own pretext for its own benefit, howsoever it wants, and yet nobody will say anything. Is this a global reality? Is this becoming a global truth?
This is what it is, right? This is what real politics is. The idea of powerful using whatever they have and national interests, whatever their interest may be, usurping basic rights. So very recently, and I think this would be very amusing for everyone to hear. But very recently, a very senior member of the Chinese Communist Party pointed out that China's trade with Russia is currently lesser than that of India. And yet, every single time Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State of the US, comes up on the podium, he starts criticizing China for behaving irresponsibly for trading with Russia. Never India, which has a larger trade with Russia. I also feel it's imperative to mention here that India, at this stage, when the entire West is rallied against Russia, India remains the only country on the face of this planet that is buying Russian weaponry. We are not talking about basic food items. We are not talking about energy that's necessary for survival. We are talking about actual weaponry, actual missiles. So India continues to supply money to the Russian arms industry, and the EU and the US don't seem to mind that. They seem to be solely concerned about China buying coal, for instance, from Russia, and there have been fingers raised at Pakistan for its attempt to buy cheaper Russian coal. So this is what it is. I unfortunately.
So Safi, being also a lawyer, I'd like to understand your point of view. What reigns supreme now? What I understand from what we are also discussing and what I've also been reading, and you as well, is that geostrategic interests are what reign supreme. What is in the interest of a country reigns supreme. The rest, human rights abuses, people being killed, genocide being launched in a country, does not matter to the world. If there is a geostrategic interest in that country, the rest will be turned a blind eye upon. Can the world function like this?
Of course not. I think that this is the exact kind of dystopian future that so many writers, so many movies, so many things have warned us against. The whole idea of us living as humans was to live in a peaceful society, not to live in a constant fear of hatred for each other. And I suppose more than anyone else at this stage, I would want to criticize the West, because it is the West that continuously upholds the idea of fundamental human rights as universal values. This was never an Eastern thing. It's not like you see the Arab states, for instance, lecturing the world on how important human rights are. But we have, on the one hand, certain countries who take a moral high ground, and when that moral high ground is constantly being violated by countries like India, these countries refuse to criticize India. So it's the hypocrisy of all of this that bothers people more than anyone else. Nobody's criticizing, for instance, an Arab nation state right now for not criticizing India here. Nobody cares, because they have never lectured you on what morality is, what ethics are, what fundamental rights are. But there are countries who have, and those are the countries then who must take the responsibility, but they refuse to. And that's what's so sad about all of this.
But Safi, then what needs to be done? I mean, if the things are going this manner and we see an imbalance as far as relationships are concerned, or even human rights and human rights abuses and how they are being treated with and dealt with by the world bodies is concerned, then whose responsibility is it to check on what's right and what's wrong?
I don't think we need to worry about whose responsibility it is. I will take an Indian example. So there's a concept that's very prevalent in India, and this is a very important concept that I have come to believe, that also a lot of other political scientists now believe in. It's called karma, very simply. Iqbal Ahmed, a very famous Orientalist of Pakistan who worked closely with Edward Said that all these countries that go around invading countries, waging wars, committing human rights atrocities in other places. So today the government in New Delhi is committing atrocities in Kashmir. What makes them think these atrocities will not come back to them in New Delhi? This is what it is. What goes around.
But you know what happens, Safi? These atrocities come to New Delhi. The first thing they'll say is that it's Pakistan based or Pakistan backed, and it's Pakistan that is involved in it.
They can say whatever. That's the beauty of the law of karma, right? They can say whatever. Whatever goes around comes around. These things we see, for instance, right now, the fact that we have had Western nations that wage war on Iraq, wage war on Afghanistan. We see them embroiled in massive wars right now themselves. We see human rights declining in these countries as well. We see their own Supreme Courts passing judgments and laws that have been unthinkable even 50 years ago. For instance, the overturning of Roe versus Wade was shocking. It's absolutely shocking for the whole world. It's a reduction in U.S. fundamental rights. And these are things that will continue to happen as long as people do not wake up to the fact that these basic rights are in fact universal, and these universal rights apply not just to them but also to all other human beings. Unfortunately, by treating one class of citizens as subhumans, they continue to make the mistake, and eventually these things come and haunt them.
Safi, where does that leave the United Nations? Where does that leave the United Nations as an organization that has the primary responsibility to overlook human rights abuses and journalistic freedom across the world as well as international journalistic communities?
I think this is where countries like Pakistan bear a great responsibility, right? Because the United Nations itself does not have any enforcement powers. The United Nations cannot do anything. It cannot enter India and rescue Mohammed Zubair, for instance. But the United Nations does serve as an open forum to raise one's voice, and I feel this is where Pakistan needs to step up. This is more material for a country like Pakistan, which can highlight these atrocities, tell to the whole world what these problems are, and in many ways, I think this is where the great art of diplomacy comes in. One has to exercise greater allyship. India has exercised a great degree of allyship and diplomacy. They have managed to have everyone on their side despite all of these problems. This is because of good diplomacy, and I think this is where we can learn a couple of things from them, for sure.
All right, but this leaves a lot of questions unanswered. Do you feel that the Indians themselves are cognizant of what is happening to their own country? Do you feel that there is a voice rising? Because the voices that rise are muted. We've seen the example of Mohammed Zubair, we have seen the example of Rana Ayyub, we have seen numerous examples. Even when it comes to Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, we see most of the leaders that are incarcerated in jail. They cannot say anything, they cannot post anything on the internet, because the minute they post it, the post is blocked one way or the other. We've seen on Twitter now almost all of the Indians do not have access to any journalist that is talking of India or that is talking of Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir. So will there be a reaction from within the Indian public, in your point of view?
I don't think so. As much as I would want to express some optimism and try and say that there should have been a reaction, with all of this happening and there being no reaction, I feel like these voices will continue to get muzzled further. And this is because of an important reason, and the most important reason here is the lack of education. Indian education system is going down the drain. People are not getting educated, they are being brainwashed. The state is putting all its efforts behind brainwashing the public. Like, just to give an example, for instance, we have this ongoing problem of Kashmir for a very long time. India, instead of in any manner holding any dialogue with Kashmiri leaders, decides that its funds and its energies are best spent subsidizing Kashmir Files, a movie that came out and was skewed towards pundits. And states within India gave people holiday, they subsidized that movie, they had people watch that movie for free. This shows what Indian states' priorities are, and this also shows what the public's priorities are. Because if the public was cognizant of this kind of nonsensical, even if we were to leave aside what the content of Kashmir Files was, let's just leave that aside for a moment. If any singular person was really concerned, they would have said, why is the state spending so much money on a movie? What's in it for the state? Why are they funding a public enterprise like this? Why are they heavily subsidizing a couple of actors? So, absolutely, at the end of the day, what they're doing is they're putting more money into one person's pockets, undeservingly so. What has that person done that deserves so much praise as per
but
the Indian government?
what this all points is towards an imbalance as far as politics is concerned, an imbalance as far as the human rights are concerned, an imbalance when it comes to the different minorities that are living within India, that calls itself the largest democracy in the world and a pluralistic country, are concerned. So many question marks, so many questions unanswered, and so many blind eyes and deaf ears towards what is happening in India. I really hope some kind of good comes out of it, because I don't see the country coming up and being called the shining India in the next couple of decades if this trend continues. Thank you so very much, Safiullah Khan, Ghauri, political analyst, who have joined us, to have talked to us about journalistic freedom, or rather the lack of it within India. And this adds to so many other things, so many other issues that are plaguing our not so friendly neighborhood country. Let's hope, we can only hope for some sense to prevail. Let's come to our last story, and that concerns the border between Mexico and the United States of America. Now, at least 46 people have been found dead in an abandoned lorry on the outskirts of San Antonio, Texas. Now, this is an area between Mexico and the United States of America. A lot of human trafficking occurs here because, as you know, human smuggling is quite rampant on that route. Now, what has happened is that at least 46 people's dead bodies were found there, and those who survived were brought to the hospital in a state that can be at the least called dehydrated. They were extremely hot because there was a lack of water. They were all suffering from heat stroke. Why? Because A, they were all cramped up in lorries. B, they were being taken up to some kind of paradise, as is always claimed by the human smugglers or the traffickers, to the United States of America. The fact remains that issues such as this particular issue is one of the gravest as far as human smuggling issues across the border between Mexico and the United States is concerned. Of course, the responses have come from the US, and people are being taken care of, but the whole issue stems up to the fact of human smuggling and human trafficking. And I hope that both the countries, Mexico and the United States, will come to some kind of an agreement or some kind of a solution as far as this is concerned. Human trafficking, human smuggling is something that is rampant across the world. We've seen scores of that from our subcontinent as well towards Europe, towards Turkey as well. This needs to be halted to some kind of mechanism evolved so that human lives are not put at stake. With that, we come to an end of today's newsroom. We'll see you inshallah tomorrow with new story segments and of course topics that pertain to you, us in Pakistan. In the meantime, as I always end my show now, since I hadn't been doing this since quite some time, but I will now start again. I've been doing that since Monday. Follow the SOPs and get yourselves vaccinated if you haven't, because COVID cases are on the rise. Allah Hafiz.